Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Jessica Donovan here. And today we are talking sleep, feeding, reflux, and more with the amazing Natasha Duffin, who is an occupational therapist working in infant and toddler sleep and reflux. So Tash is a wife and a mum to 3 little ones. And in addition to being an occupational therapist, she has additional training in sleep quality, Orofacial Myofunctional Therapy. You'll hear me struggle with that term a few times in this interview. Paediatric feeding, and she's a certified baby reflux lady. So she started working in infant sleep as a way to combine 3 of her passions: helping people, science, and babies. And Tasha's business is Whole Child Co. You must go and follow her on Instagram. We've got the link in the show notes, as well as check out her website. I just get really excited when I find other professionals that are really on the same page as we are here at Natural Super Kids, but they offer something complementary to what we offer. It's a really interesting chat about how our oral function can affect our sleep and our kids' reflux and things like that, and how these things are all interlinked: the sleeping, the feeding, the reflux, and the oral function. So I hope you enjoy this chat. Here's Tash. Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, Tash.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so good to have you, and I'm excited about this conversation. So to get started, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Tash. I'm a mum of 3, and I am an occupational therapist by trade, but I work in a kind of a bit of a non-traditional field where I help little ones or babies through to early childhood with sleep, their feeding, their oral function, and reflux. So even though I'm OT broadly, I've done lots of extra little trainings that have given me certifications in different things along the way, and they all kind of amalgamate. I kind of started out with a very traditional, I guess, what was around back when I started sleep, like learning about sleep and sleep training and stuff like that. And then as I got into it, I really realised that none of this makes sense. And there's all these contributors that how can you possibly look at sleep as in a silo without considering the whole child, which is where my business name comes from, because everything's just so interlinked, and sleep is very often a symptom of a problem. It's not the problem. And so with all those other things, I want to look at what is causing that problem.
Yeah, perfect. And that definitely is in line with our approach here at Natural Super Kids, like being kind of naturopathic focused. It's all about looking at the whole picture, not just that one isolated issue. So yeah, I love that. And such a great combo, like the sleep, the reflux, the feeding, all of that is very much linked, isn't it? So
very much, yeah.
Let's start by talking about sleep, because I know this is such a big issue for so many of our listeners. What are some of the common causes of sleep issues that you find in babies and toddlers and kids? I know that's a huge question.
Yeah. So I guess there's start really small and basic is there's the sleep hygiene stuff. And I'm very much not about you've got to have a strict routine, you've got to do this, you've got to teach your baby to fall asleep in a certain way, because I believe that every family has different priorities, different environments, different stories. But sleep hygiene can help sleep or it can hinder sleep. So, basic stuff like the balance of day sleep, the environment in terms of temperature, just those little things. I'm not a big advocate that you've got to teach your baby to self-settle to have a good sleep at all. But so, yeah, little bits of sleep hygiene can contribute. But because of my audience and because of my background, I don't really get a lot of babies that have big issues there. And also, I think you can find that stuff really anywhere. So by the time people come to me, they very much have most often gone through all the basic stuff. So what I see is a big link between reflux and pain and sleep, because a baby that is in pain and can't lie on their back because they reflux, they're never going to sleep well, because of that physiological response, but also because of that the nervous system, how that they're in that chronic fight flight, which isn't conducive to sleep. Feeding difficulties, so whether that is, manifest as early weaning from the breast, or just painful, or just feeds that are stressful for mum and bub, whether that, milk spilling, lots of vomiting, clicking, just not feeling like an enjoyable experience. And that can also translate to when they move to the bottle, because feeding is just too much. Breastfeeding is too much. But when there's oral dysfunction issues, which is a big thing that I see, those things translate to the bottle. So, yeah, feeding difficulties, oral dysfunction, and then the way that those things manifest or contribute to craniofacial development, and then how that craniofacial development affects airway architecture, which affects sleep, and so on and so forth. So I see a lot of kids with sleep disorder breathing, and like early childhood kids, and I can see the starts of that with the little babies that I work with. And a lot of tongue tie. So I very rarely get like it's a sleep hygiene, we just got to sort out where the naps fall and how that's going to work for the family. It's more the stuff that is pulling together all the pieces.
The more complex stuff, because that's the stuff that doesn't often get picked up, isn't it, by other maybe health professionals that are helping mums and dads with sleep.
Yeah, 100%. And I certainly even find now that I have, I've put lots of stuff out there about all these issues, and thankfully parents are picking that up and taking that to their healthcare providers. And thankfully, sometimes they are listened to, other times, unfortunately, they're not. But at least that we're starting to raise that awareness of like these little flags for these parents.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just really illustrates how complex sleep is and how many different factors can, affect sleep. And I'm just so fascinated about the oral function. We're going to be having a separate conversation about that for a masterclass for our club members. So if you're a club member listening, we're going to dive deep into that in a masterclass in the coming months. But for the parents listening, what are the signs or some of the common signs and symptoms that parents can look for that can mean that their child's sleep quality isn't optimal? Because it's not always really obvious, is it?
No, absolutely. And the big point there is that quality and quantity are two very separate things.
Yeah.
And even I teach other healthcare providers that when they're working with kids, it really requires very specific questioning on their behalf, because lots of parents think, I don't see my kid for 12 hours, they sleep well, but that's not the whole picture. So that's a big message that I want to always drive home. Quality and quantity are very different. So quality means that their sleep is restorative. And for kind of, preschooler, kindy, even school-age kids, and to a lesser extent toddlers and babies, but sometimes it's a bit hard to pull apart what's developmentally normal and what's them being overtired, like chronically tired. But it's that one thing is their just ability to cope with the day and how they wake up, if they wake refreshed or they're rubbing their eyes and feel like telling you they're tired from the get-go, basically. So it's that feeling of being restored from the sleep that they get. And again, the kid population rather than babies and toddlers, it's, can they sit still in class? Can they listen? Do they have developmentally appropriate emotional regulation, that kind of stuff? Obviously, we're not expecting kids to be little robots that fully developed prefrontal cortexes. But if you look at their peers and think like, this feels like it's happening a lot here, sleep is really one of the first places you want to look. And the statistics are, the research on ADHD really brings that point home. The statistics are somewhere between 25 and 50% of kids diagnosed with ADHD also have, or instead of an ADHD diagnosis, so it can be concurrent or completely separate, have a sleep disorder. So the kids, obviously ADHD is a very real diagnosis. If they also have a sleep problem, obviously their symptoms are going to be much, much worse. So the research shows that when those kids with those two diagnoses treat their sleep problem, they need a hell of a lot less medication, and their emotional regulation, their ability to sit still, listen, all that kind of stuff improves hugely. And then there's also a subset that actually don't have ADHD. When you treat their sleep, their behavior improves because they're not tired all the time. And it really brings it home when you talk to a parent about like, when you're tired, like, how good's your emotional regulation?
Exactly.
And you're a fully blown adult with a fully developed prefrontal cortex. We've got these little kids that just their brains aren't developed, and if they're chronically tired, like they've never had a real good night's sleep, then of course they're going to struggle in the day. So that's probably my biggest thing. Like, your kid, but if they don't wake refreshed and you feel like they're struggling to regulate and just cope with the day and the challenges, then that's probably the biggest thing to look at, and definitely not the quantity is the big thing. Because I do find lots of kids, two of mine fell into this camp. They had sleep disordered breathing, they slept a lot, and actually more than their peers, in terms of, and I always think of it like that was their body and their brain's way of trying to catch up on that sleep quality. It doesn't really work, but that's the way their body has tried to compensate for that. Then we have kids that fall into the other camp that can't get sleep together, wake really frequently, really resist falling to sleep. So they've definitely fallen into two camps, but yeah.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because there are so many parents out there that would say, oh, my child's such a good sleeper, or my toddler's such a good sleeper, but they're still showing these signs that you're talking about, not being refreshed, maybe some, behavioral challenges. And I love that link, between the ADHD and, that sleep quality as well. So I think so many parents listening, it gives them something to think about.
And when you dive into the research, there is so much there that it's crazy that sleep is not the first thing considered when we're looking at kids' abilities to regulate and sit still in class and listen. Like, I live in the world, so it's just like the research is coming out of my ears. But it's just crazy that that's not the number one thing. Like when you go to your GP and say, look, my kid's struggling. Yes. Let's look at their sleep.
Yeah. And it seems so obvious, doesn't it? Just like, and we would say the same for diet, when kids are eating, rubbish all day, lots of additives, not enough protein, of course, that's going to affect their their mood and behavior and sleep as well. So yeah, I and that's why I love getting experts like you on to give that sort of different approach and to help parents see things in a different light. So let's move on to reflux, because I know that's another specialty area of yours. We see a lot of babies with reflux here at Natural Super Kids, and I know reflux medications are one of the most highly prescribed medications for babies. What is your approach when it comes to reflux?
So my approach is very much that reflux is a symptom, it's not a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not very good at the adjectives and verbs, I think it's a verb. I think that it's describing what is happening.
Yes.
The stomach contents coming back out through the esophagus. So it's not a diagnosis. So my approach is, let's look at why that's happening. So I look at over 80 signs and symptoms, and I take I assess feeding, I assess lots of different things, the oral function, the way the face looks, and all this kind of stuff. And then all these birth history, lots of things. So all these things give me like little clues as to what's the contributor. And it's very, very common. Basically, the two main causes fall into two camps. So it's related to aerophagia, or swallowed air, or otherwise termed air-induced reflux, so AIR. So reflux or gastroesophageal reflux disease is kind of what we think reflux is, but actually very often it's related to swallowed air. So feeding assessment should be the number one thing before medication is prescribed. I feel like medication has a place in short-term management or in babies that have proper diagnosed GERD with a scope and it's inflamed and they're in a lot of pain. But it shouldn't be the first line, because if we can fix their feeding, then there's no need for it. But for sure, short-term pain management, investigate what's going on with the reflux. It has value. But if it's a feeding problem, why are we changing the acidity of the stomach acid with medication?
And there's downsides to that as well, you know?
Oh, yeah, a lot. And I mean, the reality is that these things there's only one approved for use in the under one population. They're designed for short-term use. But I see babies that have just been, catch you later, like, take this medication, we're not managed, like, and the parents don't know when to wean it. Exactly. And they become really scared to wean it. Yes. Because the symptoms increase with that acid rebound as the medications are weaned. So then the other, so feeding difficulties and then / oral dysfunction. Then the other thing is digestive immaturity. So not necessarily an allergic reaction, though that does exist, or an IgE-mediated allergy or anything like that, but that babies' digestive systems are different to adults, and that they don't have the digestive capacity to digest complex carbohydrates and complex proteins. They're very good at digesting fat because they've got lots of those enzymes. And as they grow older, they get those digestive enzymes. So that means that they can deal with more complex stuff in their diet. And that includes like formula, but also through the breast milk. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay. And what other, like, while we're on feeding, what other sort of feeding issues do you commonly see in babies?
So, in terms of milk?
Yeah.
Yeah. So babies that, I see quite a few that present with really difficult feeding during the day, really fussy, really pop on off, really just not into it, and then they're swallowing lots of air. And then I see that then they will feed much better at night. So when we're seeing this kind of like when they're more awake and alert and can have a little bit more volition over the choice to eat versus at night time when they're starving, exhausted, and they're just more chilled out, so they will accept a feed better. And then just difficulties with, and I'm not an IBCLC, but I am paediatric feeding trained and an orofacial myofunctional therapist. But difficulties with latch, tongue function, regulation to get on and have a nice calm feed. And look, tongue tie is a huge one, and high palate, that kind of type of stuff. So oral dysfunction is a huge thing.
Yeah, and so with these like feeding issues with babies, you're primarily looking at oral function, are you?
Pretty much, yeah.
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 Such an important area, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
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 And can you share a little bit more? Like, I'm just thinking some of our listeners might not even have come across, oral function and
orofacial myofunctional therapy.
Yes.
Yeah, we call it myo for short.
Myo, yeah, let's call it myo. I always get those terms mixed up. But can you tell our audience a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so orofacial myofunctional therapy is basically, so you can, it goes across the lifespan. So I obviously focus on little babies and kids. So it's the function of the lips and the tongue and how our oral rest posture and how we use our lips and tongue and nose and breathing, how that all affects craniofacial development. So when we're talking about babies and oral function, we're obviously focusing on their milk feeding. So how effective are they at transferring milk? How comfortable is it for mum? And how comfortable is it for baby? And are they gaining weight? Gaining weight is not the be all and end all, for sure. It is one thing to consider, because sometimes mums are killing themselves with round the clock feeding and triple feeding and all this kind of stuff. But yes, it's about how that that feeding diet is functioning in terms of, is it efficient and all that kind of stuff. So then we get into moving away from milk feeding, we're looking at how the little ones progress or don't with their solid feeding. So when we eat, we will generally break the food off at the front of the mouth, and then we need good oral function to move that food to our molar surface, or molars if we've got teeth. We need to move that food from side to side to mix it with the saliva to form a cohesive bolus on the tongue to get ready for that swallow. So if you've got weak tongue, or you've got a tongue tie, or your tongue just doesn't know what to do because it's just always had a dysfunctional movement pattern, getting that food from front to back can be really hard. And then that's when we can see some stalling with progression of textures and all that kind of stuff. And then I guess the big goal of orofacial myofunctional therapy across the lifespan is optimal oral rest posture. So it's about the tongue being suctioned to the palate at rest, lip seal, and nasal breathing. So that's how we optimize our craniofacial development. And that's essentially the kind of the end goal, with efficient, happy feeding and eating in between.
Yeah. So that oral function, and this is a lot in terms of the work that you do. Yeah, issues in that oral function can affect sleep, can affect reflux, can affect feeding, can affect our kids' behavior, and even like you just sort of alluded to then, like fussy eating, what we might class as fussy eating or picky eating, which again is such a big challenge for parents these days. It can all link back to that oral function, can't it?
Yeah, because they and it kind of with the food, it kind of self-perpetuates, because we start, like if it's like meat, for example, hard to chew, right? So you've got to get that, you've got to move it back, you've got to chew it quite a lot, get it mixed with the saliva side to side to side and ready for swallow. So if a little one figures out pretty early on, that's really too much work, they either stop eating it altogether or they start chewing it and spitting it out. And then we as parents go, well, what's the point in cooking that? They're not going to eat it. And then we're not challenging their oral motor skills to develop, and they end up kind of just going down a path, can end up going down a path of soft, easier to chew foods.
That are often highly processed and refined, and
then you end up with nutritional deficiencies, which then affect sleep, and then it all.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Yeah. So again, just planting that seed for any parents out there that do have kids that are fussy, picky, funny with textures, that it can be related to oral function. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We've kind of just touched the surface of lots of different issues. So can you tell people where they can find out more about you and what you do and how you can help?
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely. So I am on Instagram at wholechildcoau, and the same on Facebook. And my website is www.wholechildco.com.au. And I've got different blogs, and I do lots of posts about this kind of stuff pretty regularly. And obviously working one-on-one is, you can contact me through both channels.
Yeah, great. And you work online?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, perfect. And we will make sure that we link to your Instagram. Your Instagram is so great. It's got so many little, snippets of good education. And we'll make sure that we link to your website as well. Thank you so much, Tash, for coming on and talking about this with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.